Um, this lecture series is in honor of some really important people to the library, and they are the parents of some of the people in this, or at least one of the people in this room. And they created an endowment in 1984, Mary Jalonick and her husband, and I can thank Sally. And then the first lecture series, I looked this up, was in 1992. So that's the history that we're working on right now. And we haven't had it every year, but we've tried to have it when we could. And I appreciate it if this is your umpteenth lecture or your first. We really appreciate it. We're using this today because the building closest to the library is kind of under construction. This is a picture of Sally Ann's father and Mary Jalonick's father-in-law. And I can never remember the cat's name, but it was what? Mandy. Okay. All right. And he was the impetus for this lecture series. Okay. Very interested in aviation. And this is a picture of his wife from a very old standing family in Dallas. And you can read the description here, back to 1845. So you can't, say enough how long that family has lived in Dallas. Very impressive. All right, so it gets a little complicated, but George Jalonick IV was Mary Jalonick's husband and Sally Ann's brother. And he helped establish this lecture series with Mary. And you can see some of the accolades here. He was very interested in the UT Dallas Development Board and the Frontiers of Light and the Dallas Historical Society. And these are our donors today. They're all present. We're very happy to have you here, and we wish you the best. Thank you for your continued support. If you haven't been to see the History of Aviation collection, it's immediately north of the campus in a building over there. And Patrizia took a picture of the doors yesterday. So this is an environmentally controlled collection. It has, and this is Patrizia. I can't see her, but she should be in here somewhere. There she is. She runs it and does a great job. I have to tell you a little bit about the University of Texas at Dallas. They started in 1969. It became part of the UT system. It was originally a think tank for Texas Instruments. We had our 50th anniversary during the pandemic, and everybody had bought all this swag to give out, and it went nowhere because there wasn't anybody here. Right now, we have just over 30,000 students in 148 degree plans. I think 51 of them are PhD programs, mostly in STEM, science, technology, engineering. You're in an engineering building of 4 in its complex. The graduate programs were awarded rankings by U.S. News and World Report, and it came out yesterday that we are 3rd in the country with a doctorate in audiology. If you don't know, we have a speech and hearing program. And the Jindal School itself came in 38th nationally, and the MBA in Texas is 3rd. You can imagine who's 1 and 2. And our computer science graduate program is now 64th. Those sound like really kind of large numbers, but we're basically only 50 years old. So that's what we're building towards. The nice thing I looked up the other day was that 61% of the students going to school here graduate without a debt. So because of the amount of scholarships and endowments that we get to give those out. And I looked this up yesterday. We now have 800 million in endowments. So, and the library, including the History of Aviation, has a number of those. So my library is like a half a mile from here. There's a person in the room that keeps count on the entrances to that building, and in February there were 250,000 people that walked in and out of that building. That most libraries our size are seeing a decline in that, and that's not what's happening. We have about 3.6 million items, and includes 1.4 million books, paper books. And you can see the rest of it. We have 30 student study rooms that the students use with all state-of-the-art technology. You can see some of it here. We use librarians to instruct students how to use that equipment. And 2 days ago, we have begun a mission to put RFID technology in the building. And this is what this means. If we put a tag on a book, they'll go through a fancy gate, and if they haven't checked the book out, it locks the gate, and rings go off. I mean, and we go, right, come here. So that will be happening. And then I want to talk a little bit about the history of aviation. We have, you can read this, but the archives of the Civil Air Transport and Air America from the Vietnam War, the Chanspot archives, the Williams Library for the World War II, or George Williams archives, and the World War II aviation. We have a collection of Doolittle material and a lighter than air collection that's fairly old. We concentrate on World War I aviation as well as some aspects of Vietnam. The Vietnam archive itself is at Texas Tech, so we concentrate on the aviation part of that war. Most of what we have is in commercial and military aviation. And that collection includes about 20,000 books, I think almost 2,000 journals, and I'm under guidance that we have 8,000 linear feet, all environmentally controlled. And I said, is that a lot? And they said, yeah, that's a lot. Okay, so that's a lot. The development office supports us with collecting material and also gifts. And over the last 2 years, like in 2022, we received 50,000 art books from France in no order, mostly, more than half of them in languages other than English. And that's 12 years of work for my staff that just landed. So for everybody in this room, I really appreciate your continued support of both the archives and the library. So I want to introduce Mr. Jay Miller. Jay Miller is a friend. Jay Miller and his wife Susan are friends and donors of the archive. So Jay is an aviation photographer. So when he introduced himself to me, I thought, okay, so you can take planes. You take pictures of planes. Well, yes, that's true, but he puts a harness on, goes up in a plane, hangs out of the plane, and then takes the picture. He also flies drones, and I think he has a really nice car that goes fast, but I'm not positive. He's an expert. He takes an active role in helping select the speakers for this program, and he's here. I'm glad he's here. He's here to introduce Dr. Hopkins.
Okay. Thank you, Ellen. She has become a very good friend for me as I relate to the History of Aviation collection. I will be so vain as to make a few comments about the History of Aviation collection. I was the first curator of that collection, and by default, I was also the first director of that collection. That's back when it was in Austin, at UT Austin, and it was founded by George Hadaway, who I think a few of you in this audience probably know, or knew. He was a great pioneer, seriously speaking, here in probably 20th century aviation. Goes all the way back to the pre-World War II days, and he's one of the founders of the Civil Air Patrol. So anyway, George and I were close friends until his demise, and it was a great honor to be associated with him and the History of Aviation collection. But the reason I bring all of this up, the most important part of the History of Aviation collection in my career, is that that's where I met Susan. So We. All right, I need a little light here. Is that a possibility? Meantime, I'll get my cheaters out so I can see what I'm looking. Thank you. That's perfect. Too perfect. All right, I'm going to start out. Good afternoon to everybody, and I'm really pleased to see that even in light of the weather, we do have a nice gathering of hopefully aviation enthusiasts and people who have some interest at one level or another in the Strategic Air Command. But I have to start this presentation on Dr. Roberts by making a confession. Whoa, that's a good way to get things started. Anyway, Dr. Robert Hopkins III and I have been friends and colleagues for close to 40 years. We've known each other for so long that he chastises me if I call him doctor. So if you will forgive me the indiscretion, it's Bob from this point forward. Over the course of my modestly lengthy career in the aviation history and associated aviation photography worlds, I've had the privilege of befriending and being befriended by some of the most notable and accomplished aviation writers and historians on the planet. Among the many have been Ernie Gann, William Green, John W.R. Taylor, Peter Bowers, David Baker, Gordon Swanborough, Eupheme Gordon, Dennis Jenkins, Dan Hagedorn, Dick Hallion, Roger Bilstein, and the list goes on from there. It's been, as they say, a wonderful ride for me. And thanks to Bob, it continues as these words are written. In the aforementioned pantheon of goats, as they are admiringly called today, I would have to say Bob Hopkins can comfortably wear that moniker and stand shoulder to shoulder with any name on any best of the best aviation writers, historians list, both past and present. His tome-like books covering subjects, I've got about 20 pages here, so relax for a little. No, it's actually pretty. As diverse as Strategic Reconnaissance and a co-authored history of the Boeing B-47 Stratojet are books that arguably will stand the test of time. And might I say, it is a fair bet they will never be superseded. And I, as a professional aviation writer, say that with a modest deal of authority. And let me not forget to mention his apex work, his magnificent and monumental Boeing C-135 history that stands as a high watermark among all the many aircraft monographs ever written since the beginning of aviation journalism. Bob's credentials not only include his PhD in history from the University of Virginia, but also fellowships in the prestigious Royal Aeronautical Society and the Royal Historical Society. He's also worked as an associate professor, a history teacher, an adjunct lecturer, a U.S. Air Force aerial combat tactics instructor, and the editor and founder of the archetypal Journal of Military Aviation. Perhaps most importantly, as regards the presentation you're about to hear and see, Bob was a pilot and aircraft commander in the U.S. Air Force for 8 years between 1983 and 1991, primarily serving as a Boeing C-135 pilot in command. He eventually would log time in 17 different models of the EC, RC, and KC-135. I could continue for more than a few more pages, but I think it advisable at this point to step aside and let Bob speak for himself. As you are about to understand, he does so with gentle authority, a deep ocean of knowledge, and much wisdom. Ladies and gentlemen, my friend and colleague, Dr. Robert S. Hopkins III. That's going to cost you some money, Bob.
I see you got the email that I sent you. Thank you. All right, here we go. Life is good.
Do you remember in 3rd grade when your teacher caught you chewing gum and said, "Did you bring enough gum for everyone?" And of course the answer was no, I didn't. So you had to spit your gum out. Well, unfortunately, I only had 1 golf ball and 1 hot pad with the SAC emblem on it. So I didn't really have enough to bring for all of our gracious sponsors, Mrs. Jalonick, Mrs. Hudnall, Mr. Snodgrass, and of course, Dean Safley and her wonderful team, Jay and Susan. So please accept all this virtual swag. It's just a token of my gratitude for being allowed to speak to you today. So we'll move on quickly. The Strategic Air Command, or SAC Alert Force, is the amalgam of a bunch of different airplanes. Each one of those airplanes merits its own story. In fact, I've written books on 2 of them. A little shameless self-promotion there. You can go to my website, my phone. We'll move on. But what matters most is not the story of the individual airplanes, but how collectively they made a difference. Because for the very first time, you had airplanes that performed a mission that influenced not only domestic policy in the United States, international relations, but became instruments of war that would be of profound significance. If it ever went to war, the planet would probably suffer. So I argue that the Strategic Air Command Alert Force was the single most powerful military force ever compiled. And I think we'll see why. At the end of the Second World War, erstwhile allies had become enemies. Joseph Vissarionovich Djugashvili, aka Stalin, the man of iron, represented the communist bloc, the monolithic communist bloc. And on the other side, Curtis Emerson LeMay, bombs away with Kurt LeMay, lionized by his friends and those who served under him, vilified by intellectuals and those on the left. But you know what? LeMay was really subtle, and we'll see why he's so important momentarily. But if you notice, he's got this ribbon on the lower left side of his chest, and there's a little cutout showing what that is. That's the Order of the Patriotic War, first class, no less, a Soviet decoration given to select generals. So even as Chief of Staff of the Air Force, LeMay knew how to extend a middle finger to his adversaries. If war came, it would be an air war, and that's why LeMay is so important. Napoleon, Hitler both tried to invade the Soviet Union or Russia and failed. Russia has no oceanic beaches, so a naval invasion was not pragmatic. Ultimately, it would be an air war, a bomber war, and with really exciting names of the war plans like Frolic and Off Tackle and Broiler. But ultimately, it would be about bombers, B-29s, B-50s, and a few B-36s. But most importantly, they would operate from bases in England, just as they had during the Second World War. That raised the issue of vulnerability. By 1950, these piston-powered bombers were vulnerable to MiG-15s, as had been seen over Korea, and ultimately the US decided, we've got vulnerable airplanes, and now that the Soviets have the atom bomb, they can do in one day what Goering failed to do throughout the Battle of Britain, and that's destroy the American aircraft carrier known as Great Britain. So SAC said, we've got to figure out an alternative, and that was the jet-powered B-47. And we'll operate it from bases in the United States. And ultimately, it took a little while. We still had bases in England, in Spain, and French Morocco. But the goal was to get those bases out and put all the bombers in the US. Unfortunately, The B-47 had a very significant weakness: range. Curtis LeMay hated the B-47. He said it was the perfect bomber if we ever went to war with Mexico or Canada. He's probably right. So it was jet powered, it could outspeed any MiG, but it didn't have the range to get anywhere. And as a result, we had to have airborne air refueling. Tankers would refuel the B-47 as it flew toward its target. And that made the bombers vulnerable because we needed something more important than the bomber, which General Frank Armstrong said, you now have the tail wagging the dog, because we now need tankers more than bombers. The Soviets were interested in bombers too. And on Aviation Day in 1955, 10 giant Myasishchev bombers flew over Red Square. And all the Western observers clutched their pearls and began to whine and complain. Oh my goodness, they said, here are these B-52-like bombers flying all over the Soviet Union. My gosh, they're just cranking these things out. Well, some MiGs flew by, and then some more MiGs, and then some helicopters. And then all of a sudden, 18 more of these giant bombers come flying by. Well, the pearl clutching got to the point where it became diaper filling, and they're just paranoia here. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do? There's just so many of these giant bombers. 28 in one day. Well, in typical Potemkin fashion, the first 10 flew way back around, joined up with 8 more, the total of all the bombers in Russia, and then flew back again. So there weren't 28, there were only 18. But they fooled the Americans. They fooled the West. But the one good thing that came of that is the Distant Early Warning Line, a series of radar posts in Greenland, Canada, and the Alaskan territories. And that would allow the West, specifically the US and Canada, about 8 to 10 hours advance notice of any Soviet bombers inbound to the United States. Makes plenty of sense. Well, America needs hysteria, and 2 years later we had missile gap. The problem here is that the R-7 Semyorka rocket that launched Sputnik and would later launch Yuri Gagarin into orbit was the same SS-6 sapwood that could put a hydrogen bomb on New York or SAC headquarters in Omaha. So, oh my gosh, it's also going to change timing. And that meant the creation of the Ballistic Missile Early Warning System, the same as the Distant Early Warning Line, with one profound difference. Whereas the bomber detection gave us 8 hours of warning, BMUs would only give us 30 minutes. 30 minutes to Armageddon. Well, if you're in the State Department, big deal, you know, it's all crisis escalation, 56 in Suez, 58 in Taiwan, 61 in Berlin, heck, even 62 in the Cuban Missile Crisis. It proves that it's just escalation. We don't need to worry about surprise attacks. Well, across the Potomac in the Pentagon, every one of the commanders remembers being on duty on the 7th of December, 1941. And now that the Soviets had the atom bomb, the notion of an atomic Pearl Harbor terrified SAC commanders and Air Force leaders as well, because a bolt from the blue would become the basis for all of SAC's planning and contingency operations. And ultimately, the SAC Alert Force, its bombers, its tankers, and eventually its intercontinental ballistic missiles were not just aircraft, they were instruments of an existential policy. Without these aircraft and these missiles, the United States would be vulnerable. There had to be some capability that would protect the United States from attack. And these missiles, these aircraft were that. And it was pretty simple. They had three basic objectives. First and foremost was to eliminate the Soviet nuclear threat. You don't want those bombers, those ICBMs getting to you. And to placate NATO, to make sure that if the Warsaw Pact and the Soviets invaded Western Europe, the SAC alert force would be there on call. And finally, to eliminate the industrial capability of the Soviet Union. Seems pretty simple. Let me remind you, there will be a quiz later on, and this will be one of the first questions. I'm serious. In 52 and 56, if you voted for Stevenson, you probably didn't like Ike, but everybody else did. And Eisenhower was a real champion of the alert force. He believed very strongly in what it could do. And what that could do was very simple. You could provide a nuclear deterrence at a low cost and keep American boots at home and placate everybody in Europe and everybody in Japan. So for Eisenhower, the alert force was a panacea. You could balance the budget, guns and butter. Worked great. Well, all that changed in 1960. JFK ran hard in the election on the notion that Nixon and Eisenhower were soft on defense, and they were responsible for the missile gap. Well, one of the first official acts of Robert McNamara, the new Secretary of Defense, was to say, we're kind of wrong about the missile gap. It's actually the other way around. We have more missiles than the Soviets, so let's just not talk about that. What do you know? A candidate running on a lie. Who'd have thunk it? It's hard to say. But what Kennedy and his advisors did profoundly changed the alert force by altering its composition, taking away bombers, adding more ballistic missiles, adding nuclear submarines, and most importantly, the largest single buildup of nuclear weapons and strategic delivery systems in US history. All these bombers, all these missiles were the brawn, the muscle, the heart, the soul, and the brains of the SAC alert force was command and control. And not a lot of people are aware of this. In fact, I dare say if you were to mention EC-135s, you'd probably get a bunch of blank stares from people who, what's an EC? I've never heard of that. You remember Broiler and Frolic and Off Tackle, those early war plans that we mentioned? See, I told you it'd be a quiz. People are now starting to write things down. Good. Well, before 1960, if war happened, the goal was just launch everything. Herman Kahn, the economist, called it wargasm. We're just going to send everything we have. We're going to blow up the Russians, and that'll be the end of it, and we'll win. Well, that didn't work out too well because for a variety of reasons, not least of which was that the Navy felt excluded from the budget. Eisenhower put together a new strategy which ultimately eliminated this single notion war plan and created the single integrated operations plan, the PSYOP, which allowed, instead of one attack, there would be major attack options, such as we're going to nuke the Soviet Union, China, and Eastern Europe, and there would be selected attack options. We'll only nuke the Far Eastern Soviet naval bases, for example. Those are hypothetical, so you don't have to worry about putting your brain in a safe when you get home. And secondarily, Eisenhower approved, and ultimately JFK would do the same, the Looking Glass, the airborne command post. It's called Looking Glass because it mirrored the function of the SAC command post. In the event, a certain event, that the SAC command post would be destroyed by an incoming Soviet ballistic missile, the airborne command post could take over and carry out the same orders and instructions that the national command authorities, President, Vice President, Secretary of Defense, might require. It was manned by a general officer and could effectively replace any commander within the entire unified system. Think land, think PAC in the Pacific, think in Europe. So it was a pretty significant event, and I'd like to take a moment here to digress a little bit and walk you through something you never have gone through before. In the event of a bolt from the blue, kind of works like this. The very first thing that happens is the U.S. attempts to verify that this is a valid threat. Pick up the phone. BMUS, this is NORAD. Do we see ballistic? Confirmed. Clear Alaska, this is NORAD. Do you see ballistic missiles? Verify. You don't want a false alarm, and there have been several. Secondly, you notify the president. Let me remind you that this is 60 years of evolution and evolving technology. We have this vision today that the president is followed by somebody with a briefcase and is in constant contact. And that wasn't always true. So let's say it's 1962 and the missiles are on their way in, and you got to find JFK and tell him, what are we going to do? Well, he snuck off to the Lincoln bedroom with Angie Dickinson for the best 45 seconds of her life. And now we got to find him. So, Jackie, is the president in there? No, he said he was going to the Oval Office to do some paperwork. So now you got to find JFK. Who knows where he is? But time is running out. Nowadays, it's certainly a lot more sophisticated. But you've got to realize that time is ticking away. In his autobiography, Ronald Reagan wrote, "How in the world could you ever decide the future of the world? Armageddon in just 6 minutes." And that's all you've got. In 1980, there was a false alarm. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, the national security advisor for Jimmy Carter, got the phone call. So we're back at step one again, right? Haven't even gotten to inform the president. So they call back and they say, "Zbig, it's a false alarm. Don't wake Jimmy. Life is good." What if it had not been a false alarm? If it had been real? So Zbigniew picks up his phone, calls Jimmy Carter. "You've got 6 minutes at 3 a.m. There's no time to convene the cabinet. You can't pick up the phone and get the Vice President and Secretary of Defense Harold Brown on the phone." Jimmy gets 3 questions in those 6 minutes. The first one is, "Zbig, what would you do?" "Well, Mr. President, you can order retaliation according to the appropriate PSYOP option, or you can allow the United States to be unilaterally annihilated in a nuclear holocaust. Those are your options." I guarantee you Jimmy's second question would be, "Rosalind, what do I do?" Well, the late Mrs. Carter is the only one who knows the answer, but I'm sure Jimmy's third question was, "Dear Lord, what do I do?" So you've got 6 minutes to decide. And ultimately, whoever holds up his hand on the 20th of January or her hand on the 20th of January has to make this decision then and not at 3 a.m. when the phone rings. So we've now reached a point where Jimmy's going to retaliate. Well, I believe that only Dwight Eisenhower and only Jimmy Carter were the 2 presidents who had the horsepower and the acumen to be able to say, I know which PSYOP option I'm going to choose. The rest, boy, just imagine, pick a president of your choice and make a big league decision about who's going to make the right choice and which PSYOP option. So, hey, it's big. Which option? Oh, do PSYOP option 3. Okay, great. We got that all planned. Now all I got to do is pick up the phone, call the National Military Command Center and say, this is the President of the United States. I order a nuclear strike on the Soviet Union. And the colonel on the other end says, that's nice. Please verify who you are. Well, you know, the president carries this little biscuit with him. And there's one in the National Military Command Center as well. So Jimmy, being an outstanding president, has his on the nightstand. He picks it up, rips it open, and says, grapefruit. And the colonel on the other end opens his, grapefruit. Okay, Mr. President, we got you. Let's go to war. War Plan R. And if you know what War Plan R is, you know that it's the favorite of General Ripper and Major Kong. But wait a second. The amount of time I took to tell you about this, what, half of 15 minutes? And why just 15 minutes? Because there's another half. And that's, how do you get SAC's alert force out and doing its job? Well, the first thing SAC does is push the button. And every radio, every landline starts warble, warble, warble. For the alert force, klaxon, klaxon, klaxon. And everybody panicked. You run to the airplane. If you're in the alert facility during the day, we used to be at the airplane in 3 or 4 minutes at the most. At night, add maybe another minute. You're flying suit and you get your leg in the wrong one. And you hop out and you got your boots on. You could be at the gym. You could be at the base theater. You could be at the base exchange. I was in the sauna one time when the horn went off. You know, you're flying, forget personal chafing. But you go to war with what you got, right? So you run out to the airplane and you start firing off the carts. The engines are roaring. And while you're doing that, the navigator's back there listening to the message. X, 3, 2, whatever it happens to be, and he decodes that message. Sometimes it was start the engines. Occasionally it was, this is a mover. You're going to taxi out of the alert facility, cross the runway, accelerate to 50 knots, pull the power, and come back. That was my favorite. You got to do something on alert instead of sitting around. What are you going to do when it says kill millions of people? Who wants to be first? Raise your hand if you want to put your career on the line thinking, I've mistakenly decoded a practice alert for go to war. So I guarantee you at every SAC base, the first thing you'll hear on the radio is, control, say message. Everybody's asking to repeat the message again. Can it be? Is this really a go to war message? Well, it is. And so now you've got all these airplanes trying to get airborne at the same time. And what was called the minimum interval takeoff of MITO. 12 seconds between like airplanes. Every 12 seconds, B-52s will become airborne. 30 seconds between different airplanes. And you've got them all warbling off into space. And you've got to do that before the missiles start coming in. That's why that first 15 minutes is so critical. A B-52G on alert weighs exactly 500,000 pounds. After start engines, taxi, and takeoff, it's 488,000 pounds. And as it becomes airborne, it looks like a wounded duck, just struggling to stay airborne. And if it's in the jet wash of an aircraft in front of it, it's even worse. Now imagine if you're at Kinchlow or K.I. Sawyer or Loring, one of the bases farther to the north, that 30 minutes 28 minutes. So a Soviet 5-megaton warhead detonates over Grand Forks, and the overpressure pushes that B-52 into the ground. In 1961, Kennedy advisor Carl Kaysen estimated 65% of the alert force would be destroyed before it left North America, mostly due to attrition like this. You've now gone through those first 30 minutes of how the United States would go to war. Over the next 20 years, it became more sophisticated. Airborne command posts could launch ballistic missiles. They could update where bombers are and effectively become far more capable in near real-time battle management. The next step was perhaps the most frightening. People were now talking about winning a nuclear war because they had a survivable second strike. Fortunately, Gorbachev's adaptability, Reagan's engagement ensured that capability did not become intent. But it would fall ultimately to Reagan's successor, George Bush, to end the alert force. On the 28th of September, he decreed that all nuclear weapons and combat mission folders would be removed from all the bombers on alert. And this photograph shows the B-61s, a clip of 4 plus 12 air-launched cruise missiles being removed from the B-52H at Fairchild Air Force Base in Spokane. The alert force, created on the 1st of October, 3 days before Sputnik, had now come to an end. But you know, the alert force is still with us. You watch movies, you got music. Heck, even Texas's own Willie Nelson, on alert again. I can't wait to get on alert again. I'm not going to sing the rest, you'll vomit, and I can't bother with that. But the alert force brought with it a new vocabulary. We lived in the mole hole because it was underground. Warm in the winter, cool in the summer, great chow. And you got away from your family for a few days, and so it was a pleasant place to be. They also had a Christmas tree. If you look carefully, this one's upside down. You can actually see how it looks like a Christmas tree where the alert aircraft are parked. But what I'd like you to do is look at this in a different way. Those 2 white airplanes are airborne command posts, and each one is capable of launching 1,000 Minuteman ICBMs with up to 3 nuclear warheads apiece. I don't want you to see 5 B-52s there. I want you to see 120 hydrogen bombs. That's a different way to look at SAC Alert Force. Because ultimately the question is the SAC Alert Force for retaliation or for strike? Depends on who you ask. This guy would say it's a first strike weapon designed to attack the Soviet Union. Oh no, of course our SAC generals would say, oh no, the president would say. Well, if you look at wargaming documents, there are 4 scenarios. One is zero warning, bolt from the blue. The second is tactical warning, hours, maybe a day. The third is strategic warning, days, weeks, maybe even months. And the fourth's almost always blacked out. But if you dig deep enough, it's preemption. And yes, it was, in fact, capable of being a first strike. You know, I really hate putting charts and graphs in PowerPoint, so please forgive me. But if you look at this blue number, you'll see that 34% of all the aircraft and delivery systems assigned to the PSYOP, 34%, 1/3, would destroy 75% of the Soviet nuclear capability, 93% of the leadership, the command and control, and 2/3, 65% of Soviet urban industrial capacity. And in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see 88%. And what that means is that that alert force would destroy 88% of Soviet defenses. And that means that there is no obstacle for the remaining 1,000+ aircraft and missiles to come through and complete their mission. If you read SAC histories, they all call the war in Southeast Asia a distraction because it distracted from SAC's primary mission of deterring nuclear war. Unfortunately, every one of those F-105s barreling down Thud Ridge, and whenever Robin Olds and his MiGs all got entangled, they all required air refueling. So that meant KC-135. And William Westmoreland really wanted that B-52 flight as flying artillery because he was busy winning the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese people. So the SAC's commanders would say, enough. You're taking all our airplanes away and we're taking them off alert. And Joint Chiefs and Bob McNamara and Melvin Laird would say, you don't understand, General. We're taking them whether you like it or not. So all these bombers and all these tankers go to Southeast Asia. And every SAC commander publicly says, yes, I'm fully aware that this has an impact on our planning, and I don't think it's that significant. Well, let me tell you, it was profoundly significant. At the end of 1968, there were 150 B-52Ds, Gs, and Hs on alert, plus B-58s. At the end of May 1972, there were 29 B-52Hs and 9 FB-111s on alert. The total bomber force dropped by 80%. Well, one shouldn't be a problem with those FB-111s. They're not involved in Southeast Asia. No, they're not. But guess what? Their tankers are. So you can't fly an FB-111 to its target without a tanker. Remember that wagging the dog thing? See, I told you to be quick. So the bomber force is now dropped by 80%. That raises a really good question. If 29 is the lowest the SAC commander would go, how come you need 150? Because ultimately, every single SAC commander comes to Congress and says, I need 2,040 B-47 to deter the Soviets. I need 740 B-50. I need 100 B-1. I need 100 B-21. Well, if 29 works, why do you need that much? How much does deterrence cost? I don't know the answer, and most people really don't know it either. But we sure have spent a whole lot of money when we really didn't need it. I gave a presentation on the end of the Cold War. When it was over, this retired boom operator came up to me, starts tapping on my chest. I disagree with you on everything you said. The SAC alert force, it won the Cold War. I hear you. Would you stop pounding on my chest, please? You know, because every day them Ruskies would wake up and they'd look at the big board or their overhead and they would see the SAC alert force and they would say, not today. I ain't going to attack the USA today. Well, in the 30 years I've been writing history about Strategic Air Command, I've also been studying the Soviet response to Strategic Air Command. And I've been in contact with former Soviet generals, politicians, and current Russian officers and politicians. And they all say the same thing. We were terrified of that. It was a first strike weapon designed to hit us. We had no plan to attack you in a bolt from the blue scenario. Yes, we had a war plan for the U.S., but it was in the event that war escalated and became inevitable. And if you don't believe me, look at Able Archer 83. That's clear proof that the Soviets perceived the United States unilaterally moving to attack the Soviet Union. Well, putting all this together, you have to ask, for all the money spent, for all the lives lost, yes, people have been killed on Earth. Was it worth it? And I'm going to say the answer is mixed. Militarily, I say it was not worth it. Because remember, what was the first objective of the alert force? That was to eliminate the Soviet nuclear threat against the United States. In the event that the alert force was retaliatory, by the time the missiles got there, the bombers got to the Soviet Union, the submarines launched all their missiles, all they'd hit would be empty silos and empty air bases. Yeah, I know, don't waste my time talking about SRF and reconstitution and reloading silos. Heck, by this time, second and third strike, the entire northern hemisphere of this planet is a nuclear winter and uninhabitable. Please, for the love of God, tell me what that third strike is going to accomplish. Politically, I think the alert force was a profound success. It reassured Americans. I mean, Eisenhower was right. For the cost of the alert facility, for the cost of the aircraft on alert, however many that number would actually be, you could achieve a reassurance among American leaders that you didn't need more. We spent billions. We could have spent trillions. But the alert force helped prevent that excess purchase from happening. It also provided reassurance to our NATO allies and to Japan. The American nuclear umbrella was real, and it would indeed protect Western Europe, Japan, from a potential Soviet attack. You know, you may not agree with the things I've shared with you today, but I hope you'll appreciate the fact that ultimately the alert force was not a story about B-52s or B-58s or ICBMs. It was the story of an amalgamation, a collective of weapons that achieved political and military objectives, some good, some not so good. And with that, if I have caused you to think about these issues, I have succeeded. I thank you. Yes, I'd be happy to take questions. You gotta make sure I have a little dihydrogen oxide here.
No, I just want, could you comment maybe what on the thought process was with the recent event, the Chinese sending a balloon over the United States, what SAC's thought process might have been in that instance?
As you all know, the Chinese sent a reconnaissance balloon over the U.S. and it floated for several days. SAC officials, there is no more SAC, as you know, it was established in 1992, would probably have done nothing because it's not in their purview. My personal belief is that it was much ado about nothing because Google Earth provides nearly the same quality of imagery as the satellite. And having flown reconnaissance in the past, we have to fly airplanes with listening capability along the periphery of denied territory. The Chinese just get in their cars and drive right up to whatever they want to listen to. So I'm not sure that there's anything that it would have collected that would have upset the apple cart. That's purely my opinion. But SAC officials would have picked up the phone, called NORAD, and said, that's your problem, not ours. Does that answer your question, sir? Yes, sir. I'm going to get in trouble. This gentleman's going to ask me a question. He's an old B-52 pilot. So,
Now, I'll ask you a modern question. What do you think about the push now for the new triad? You know, we getting new bombers and subs and missiles.
Right.
Is there a need to do that?
yes. And here's the best reason in the world. Let's pretend that this guy in the Kremlin decides that a terrorist attack sponsored by Ukrainian terrorists kills 140 people at a disco in Moscow. And he decides he's going to nuke Ukraine. And then he says, after that dust is settled, I want Hungary, I want Poland, and I want Finland out of NATO, or I'm going to start nuking one of them at random. Well, how do you signal a response to that? You launch the bombing. Why? Because you can recall the bombing. You give Vladimir 8 hours to think about his stupid decision and realize that you're going to play ball too. So you can escalate with the bombers. Plus, you can launch the bombers in a false alarm. You may be familiar with launch under attack, launch on warning. These are strategies. A bomber force can be launched easily and recalled. Unlike the movie Failsafe or Dr. Strangelove, where OPE or whatever it is to get James Earl Jones and Major Kong to fly home. Having a bomber force is a very important part of strategic nuclear deterrence. And I think very strongly that a triad is more effective than a dyad, especially if one day somebody figures out how to invalidate submarines. And then you're just down to ICBMs, at which point nobody's going to pull the trigger. Does that answer your question, sir? Any others? Yes, sir. I think the two most important presidents in the history of SAC would be Jimmy Carter and Dwight Eisenhower for all they did for SAC and nuclear deterrence. The worst would be George H.W. Bush for allowing Don Rice, the Secretary of the Air Force, and Tony McPeak, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, to completely reorganize the Air Force and do away with SAC out of McPeak's hostility towards Strategic Air Command and his belief in what became the fighter mafia. As we saw from B-52s flying from North Dakota to Barksdale with live nuclear weapons, whoops, didn't know that was on the airplane. Or missileers who are stoned or on drugs and failed personal reliability program, PRP. I think the greatest single disaster was doing away with SAC. It was a vendetta. And as you know, we had Air Combat Command. We put the tankers under American Motors, AMC. And that was a mistake because they're only trash haulers and they use the tanker hours that are dwindling to haul garbage instead of refueling aircraft. And there was no strike command at the time. So what a disaster that was. Does that answer your question? I couldn't be any clearer in my contempt for that incident. Any other?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Hello?
Yes, sir.
What do you think Sci-Spot or combat Sci-Spot played in the 50th century in the late 60s and 70s and stuff?
Make sure I'm on the same page. Are you thinking about the targeting system in Southeast Asia for the B-52 strike? Thank you. I think that in the late 60s, when Sky-Spot was first implemented, SAC was resistant because it still viewed its mission as putting a hydrogen bomb on Moscow. The legacy, I think, really becomes apparent not in the 60s, but in the 80s, after El Dorado Canyon, when Jack Chain, who was ThinkSAC at the time, said, we could have done that. We didn't need F-111s to fly from England all the way around to bomb Libya. We could have done that with a couple of B-52s. And then Chain focused a conventional capability in SAC. And Sky-Spot became a model for how that conventional capability should be put together. Does that answer your question generally? Okay. Was there one other question? Yes, sir.
Yeah, question and historical statement.
Sure.
So the first question is, where were you stationed at when all this was taking place in the 80s?
My first assignment was ECs and KCs at Grissom in Indiana. And then I transferred to the Recon RC-135 community up in Eielson, Fairbanks, Alaska. And then after my tour there, relocated to Recon headquarters in Offutt and spent most of my remaining 2 years in the sandbox. And I seen Desert Storm, came home, and they said, we're friends with the Russians now, and we want to be friends with everybody. So we're going to do a whole lot more with a whole lot less. And I said, no, thank you. I'm third generation. I've done my duty, and I went off to become a history professor. So that's my story.
And a little historical update, we were both in Europe as kids, dependents, during the Cold War. And I was the Air Force ROTC Cadet of the Year twice.
Wow.
So I had a chance to be probably the DC-135 training.
Excellent.
I actually refilled in that Fort Phantom twice.
Excellent.
So it was fun.
The Phantom is one of the hardest to refuel, by the way, because the receptacle is very small, and USAF pilots are pretty good, but the West Germans were terrible. We call them cowboys because they just couldn't figure out how to hold the airplane still. And yeah, absolutely. Another question? Yes, sir.
Looking at your description here, you did some verifying flights over the Soviet Union. Is there anything you can discuss? Were there any interesting stories from flying those missions, which is pretty boring?
Let me clarify. I never overflew the Soviet Union. I flew peripheral.
Got it.
There have not been military overflights in the Soviet Union since December '56, when Eisenhower put the kibosh on that after Operation Sea Lion, which was SAC RB-57Bs over Vladivostok. My missions off the Soviet Union for verifying foreign compliance with international treaties like INF. I flew Cobra Ball and Cobra I. Those were airborne platforms where we monitor incoming ballistic missiles and reentry vehicles. Our sensors would track them and collect technical data about them, which we'd send to Foreign Technology Division at Wright Pat. They do their magic. I'm very proud to say that my crew flew the first operational mission of the Cobra I, the RC-135X, Single most expensive airplane in history, $1.4 billion. They gave me the keys to that. Stupid people. And it was sponsored by the Army and STIO, and it was very capable. You could detect the heat of a basketball from 2,000 miles away. So, the sensor was designed to discriminate between a natural reentry vehicle and a decoy based on its heat signature. So, in a way, with Cobra Ball and INF, I made tiny little contribution to the end of the Cold War, and that's my greatest accomplishment in the Air Force. Anything else? I know you're all thirsty, and Dr. Sapling, oh, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. There were, but those were civilian. The last military overflight was 10 December 1956. He was a civilian CIA pilot. Yes, sir. He was not in the military at the time. Yes, sir. And that's. Yeah. If you'll see me after class, we'll take care of your grade. You bet. I'm with you. That's it. And please, I am not Dean Wormer, so you don't have to worry about that at all. Anything else? I know Dean Safley would like to get to the wine, and I'm sure everyone else would as well.
I'd like to thank Dr. Hopkins, his wife Amy. I'd like to thank Jay Miller and his wife Susan. I'd like to thank my staff that's in the building. The curators for the university archives are here, and they will probably introduce themselves. They all specialize in a particular different thing. So I think we're adjourned. Outside in the hallway, there should be refreshments, but when we started, they weren't here. So I'm hoping they're there. Thank you all for coming. I really, really appreciate you coming. Thank you.